Hello, everyone. Welcome, bienvenidos. My name is Leah Schmalzbauer, and I am a professor of sociology and American Studies at Amherst College. And I am so excited to be talking with you. I'm sorry that we can't be in person right now, but we'll do our best on Zoom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes today in a recorded talk about immigration to the United States from Central America. I'm a scholar of immigration, and I've been asked to talk about what is going on at the US border right now and to give some context. So this is what I'm going to do today is talk about the context specifically of Central American migration from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which is the northern triangle of Central America, and to really talk about it and to get us thinking about it as not a border crisis, as it's talked about in the United States, but really as a humanitarian crisis that has a really deep historical, political context that I'm hoping we can address when we're together. So migration to the United States is typically talked about in US policy circles as a domestic policy issue. And thus the policy solutions that arise in the United States tend to be focused domestically. So they tend to be focused on border security or legalization programs. We talk about immigration reform. And in the rare cases that we do talk about immigration in a more global way, we tend to look at fixing the governments of the countries that are the senders of immigrants. So thinking about ways to fix their policies at home, or talking to Mexico about their role in stopping Central American migration. But today I want to argue and talk about immigration not as a domestic issue, but really as an issue that is global and that's generated by international policies, international military policies, political actions, and economic policies. So to truly understand the immigration to the United States from Central America, you have to have a grasp of the complex history of US policy in Central America, and specifically US intervention in this region. So I want to say that migration does not happen in a vacuum, that people move when their lives are disrupted, and they tend to move to places in which they have connections. So if you're not moving with a job already in hand, you are likely moving to a place where you have family, where you have ties, where you have networks that can help you incorporate into the new place, help you find housing, jobs, etc. And it is typically military and economic interventions or policies that are at the root of these disruptions. So let's start with some of the core issues that shape immigration from Central America to the United States. I mean, as you likely know from your own country, what is happening at the US right now is that there are thousands upon thousands of Central American migrants who are at the US border trying to seek asylum. Trying to get into the United States to seek asylum. And during the pandemic, there was a halt put on anyone who could seek asylum at the southern border by the Trump administration. That is being renegotiated, and there's been more of an opening from the Biden administration to re-acknowledging claims for asylum. But we are overrun at the border. There are not enough places for families to go, families to be protected. And so this is being framed as a crisis. And indeed, it is. It is absolutely a crisis. But what I want us to think about is the way that this crisis has been shaped, the way it's been formed, and what people are fleeing from, and also what people are migrating to in the United States. So The other thing that I want us to keep in mind is that migration from Mexico, from Central America to the United States is really longstanding. But what has shifted in the past decades, and especially in the past several years, is also the demographic orientation of that migration. So whereas historically, the majority of migrants to the US were men, what we are seeing now is that the vast majority are women, children, or entire families. And this is something that's really quite different. So why is this? I want us to think about what's going on that is causing even some of the most vulnerable members of society, children, to make a dangerous journey to the United States. And I want to talk about migrants who are leaving economic insecurity, they're leaving violence, and most recently, they're leaving the impacts of natural disaster, especially a really terrible hurricane that happened in 2020 and wreaked terrible damage in Central America, mostly in Honduras. They're also, though, being pulled to the United States by demand for their jobs, for their labor. And so there are jobs that are waiting to be filled. And this is another piece of the story. So I want to start by talking about violence, because violence is something that is getting a lot of attention in Central America and in the US immigration debate. But I want to talk about the roots of this violence. So the majority of the people who have fled Central America over the past several years cite violence and crime as the primary motivation for their migration. And indeed, my research, early research in my career was in Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. And I remember in 2005, 2006, when I was in Honduras, my research participants and also my research team in Honduras would often say, yes, you need to not be on the streets at night. It's not safe. It's not dangerous. And actually, I changed my research program when I became pregnant and became a mom because I didn't feel like it was a place for me to be as a pregnant researcher because of the insecurity at the time. And I bring this up because I'm also really aware of my ability as a US scholar to leave Honduras, to move freely, to decide where and when it's safe to do research. And I'm very aware that the people who are fleeing Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala right now do not have that same safety of passage, safety of travel. So whereas Honduras is a country I know well from my research, and it has one of the highest murder rates in the world today, as high as countries that are at war, often compared to levels in Syria. But El Salvador and Guatemala also have very high rates of violence. And most of this violence is generated by gangs, but it's also police violence and paramilitary violence that is occurring in these countries. So to understand the epidemic of gang violence in Central America, we have to go back a few decades to the civil wars that were fought starting in the 1960s in Central America through the 1980s. And the context at this time is the Cold War. And there were peasant uprisings against right-wing leaders whose policies supported the economic and the business elite. And Central America at this time is really a chessboard for the US and what at that time was the Soviet Union. So it was capitalist interests and communist interests that are fighting it out in places in Africa and also in places in South America. And Central America is a really important focal point of this Cold War battle. The US at this time is funding right-wing militaries and dictators in Central America in the name of defeating communism. And most Americans in the United States were then and continue to be quite ignorant about what happened during this time. So most Central Americans who were fleeing their countries, fleeing the violence, and arrived in the US in the late 1970s and the 1980s, who were fleeing the civil wars, were actually denied asylum in the United States. And they were denied asylum because the US was allies with the leaders and the governments that they were fleeing. So this is a really important thing to know about asylum and refugee policy in the United States, is that it's very political. And if you are fleeing a government that's an ally, you're very unlikely to find asylum in the US. If you're fleeing a government that's an enemy, if you're fleeing Cuba, asylum is much easier to obtain in the United States. So the denial of asylum is really important because it means it's much more difficult to incorporate. If you are fleeing violence, but you're denied an asylum claim, it means you are in the United States as an undocumented migrant. And the first waves of Central Americans into the United States in the 1980s, most of them ended up to be undocumented because they were denied asylum. And many of the young men who were parts of these waves, who were fleeing the wars, who had been part of the wars, had been armed in either fighting for the government or fighting for the resistance. They formed gangs. The first formation of the infamous MS-13 gang was in LA, in Los Angeles, in 1980. And it was formed by young Salvadorans who had fled the civil war there. And then when those gang members were arrested for criminal activity and were deported, they brought MS-13 with them back to El Salvador. So it surprises many people to hear that MS-13 was actually born in the United States, was deported to Central America, and then grew in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and in Honduras, because there was very little economic opportunity for these young men to plug back into in their home country. So this is still a really important base for the violence in Central America. The gangs in Central America have been empowered by economic insecurity, and they've been empowered by high unemployment, under-resourced schools, and lack of a social safety net. They've also been empowered by a high prevalence of guns, which some can be traced even as far back as the Civil War, but there is also a large weapons trade between the United States and Central America. There is an economy that is thriving in Central America, and it is a drug economy. And Honduras and El Salvador are now the primary drug routes from South America to the United States. It used to be Colombia, but because of shifts in demand and also crackdowns and security in Colombia, the trade routes have shifted. So this means that more money in the drug war from the United States is being infused into Central American military and police forces, which is actually feeding that violence. So yes, migrants are fleeing gangs, and we hear about this from most people, as I said, who are fleeing. But in many cases, they're also fleeing the police, or they're fleeing because they don't feel like they would be protected by the police or by the military. Something I want to mention is that the violence and the political insecurity in Central America crosses class lines, but the ability to leave the violence or to protect oneself from the violence and the economic security does not. The economic insecurity often does not. So whereas more privileged Central Americans are able to send children to the United States to study, to attend university or college, who speak English, are able to take advantage of opportunities in other places, or can at least obtain tourist visas to leave the country, it's much more difficult for poor Central Americans to obtain a legal pathway to the United States. Few have family members with citizenship and the resources to sponsor them to come to the United States. And many of the poorest Central Americans do not have the professional skills to obtain work visas or to obtain opportunities, to seize opportunities in the United States. The other base of the migration out of Central America right now is economic insecurity. And very simply, most Central Americans who are fleeing Central America right now are fleeing because they are poor, they can't protect themselves from violence, and they are poor and do not have opportunities to better their economic situations in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras. And I want to talk about, just briefly get us thinking about the way that globalization forces and US trade policies have really formulated this economic security and thus stimulated migration. In particular, subsistence strategies that have really kept poor families afloat for generations have been disrupted by shifting trading relations with the United States, and also shifts to more neoliberal economic policies, which have both eroded the social safety net intentionally to try to make the economies more efficient, but also have shrunk the public sector, which is where many working class people could find employment in the past. So we know that the vast majority of migrants to the US from Central America had rural origins. They came from agricultural families originally. And with the integration of global agricultural markets that have been enforced via regional trade agreements like the Central American Free Trade Agreement, small farmers were hit and have been hit really hard by trade policies that force them to compete head to head with big, major agricultural producers in the United States. So over the past 2 decades, we've seen Central America, Mexico as well, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, become flooded with US produced goods. If you add to this drought, you add to this climate disasters, the hurricane, as I said, this fall, you see this economic crisis worsening. So many people from rural areas migrate first to the cities, join informal economic activity, try to find work in factories. When this work isn't sustainable, it's much easier from cities to plug into networks to migrate to the United States. So again, I think a big takeaway is that people migrate when their lives are disrupted, and life in Central America has been disrupted economically. It's been disrupted by violence that goes back to military intervention in the civil wars, specifically in the 1980s. Finally, I just want to mention the pull side of migration. The US has long been dependent on migrant labor. The US economy has long been dependent on migrant labor. And ultimately, this is a story of an ever wealthy portion of the US economy, of the US elite, really, who are dependent on migrants to support their wealthy lifestyles. So we have undocumented labor, which is now the base of the low-wage service industry in the United States. And many families who rely on migrants, and majority Latino migrants, to provide childcare, to clean their homes, to landscape their houses, their yards, to launder their clothes, and to work in many of the restaurant kitchens, which are very popular destinations for the middle class and the elite in the United States. So many of the migrants who are at the border, who are trying to come in, would actually have jobs waiting for them if they were granted asylum. The demand is that high for migrant labor. Now, before I close, I just wanted to say a few things about the children who are at the border, because the humanitarian aspect of this, the human rights issue of small children as young as 8, 9 years old, but more often than not, teenagers who are migrating on their own. There has been quite a bit of research done to talk with these teenagers and to say how is it that you're here alone? And I think it's often an unfair assumption that it's bad parenting, or it was that their parents just sent them, or don't care about their safety. What most teenagers say is that we are coming to help our families, that we are coming because we are in search of employment in the United States so we can send money home to help those who are there. Or they say we are coming to join our family because my mother or my father or my sibling is already in the United States. So the idea of this very alone child is a little bit misguiding, because they're often part of very strong family networks and are really employing migration as a way to support and contribute to their family and to rejoin their families in many cases. So in conclusion, we face a conundrum in the United States. We have policies that have long generated migration, and yet our border is closed for the most part to those whose lives those policies have uprooted. President Biden's administration is talking about this for the first time in my memory, of really thinking about how development issues, how issues of poverty and violence are contributing to migration, and actually talking about U.S. complicity in these policies. So we are in a time in our country now where we're really grappling. We've been grappling with immigration for a long time, but I'm hoping we'll be thinking more honestly about what the responsibility is for the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in our midst right now. So as you prepare for our session together, which I'm really, really looking forward to, I ask that you think about the immigration situation in your own countries, because I'm talking about this from the US perspective, but this is not just a US issue. Immigration is an issue throughout South America and also throughout Central America and Mexico. How have your countries been impacted by shifting economic policies, by shifting trade policies, and also by the crises that are unfolding in Central America right now? How are citizens in your countries responding? Are you talking about immigration in your classrooms? These are some topics that I would really like to explore when we're together soon. I guess it's like, I'm trying to think, is it a few weeks or over a month, but we'll see you soon, again on Zoom. So what I'm going to do is send out a reading, an article that can help also inform our conversation. But I really look forward to a dynamic exchange where we can talk about our own experiences of immigration, how we're thinking about it, how we're experiencing it ourselves. And I look forward to seeing you soon. So thank you very much.